In 1868, Britain launched one of the most extraordinary military expeditions of the Victorian era. Not one of conquest, but to rescue British subjects being held in the heart of Africa. The enemy? A proud and unpredictable emperor of an ancient Christian kingdom. The challenge? Marching an army 400 miles inland across some of the toughest terrain on Earth. This is the story of the British expedition to Abyssinia, a daring rescue mission that combined brilliant logistics, battlefield heroics, and tragic misunderstandings. Abyssinia, known today as Ethiopia, is one of the oldest continuous civilizations in the world. It had long preserved its independence and maintained a rich cultural identity rooted in its ancient Christian faith, dating right back to the 4th century, when it became one of the first nations to adopt Christianity as a state religion. Surrounded by predominantly Muslim territories and European empires, Abyssinia remained proudly self-governing throughout the scramble for Africa. Emperor Tewodros II, sometimes rendered in European records as Theodore, rose to power in 1855. A self-made man, he had fought his way to the throne through sheer will and determination. At first, he was hailed as a reformer, a unifier of fractious provinces, a champion of modernisation, and an enemy of slavery. But as the years passed, his rule became increasingly unstable. Tewodros' behaviour swung wildly from generous acts of diplomacy to brutal retribution. He faced frequent rebellions from semi-autonomous warlords and survived at least 17 assassination attempts, being wounded on 6 occasions. He was rarely seen without a sword, pistols and a lance, always ready to defend himself. In 1862, hoping for an alliance with a fellow Christian power, he wrote to Queen Victoria suggesting a joint front against his Muslim neighbours. Whether by oversight or by design, his letter languished in the archives of the Foreign Office. For nearly 2 years, the Emperor waited in vain for even a formal acknowledgement. In frustration, Tewodros imprisoned British consul Charles Cameron, as well as a number of missionaries and their families. To the Emperor, this was a diplomatic lever. To Britain, it was an unacceptable affront. Initially, Britain sought a diplomatic solution. A new envoy was sent, only to be imprisoned as well. Public pressure in Britain mounted. How could the world's most powerful empire allow its subjects to be literally chained in an African fortress? The safety of expatriates living abroad has always been a problem for governments all around the world. I mean, what can be done if their citizens are imprisoned, robbed, tortured or killed? Especially when those acts are committed by a government. Nowadays, the answer is, well, probably not a lot, apart from protests and maybe some sanctions. But the 19th century was a different time in history. At the height of her power, Britain believed that her subjects deserved protection, and she had the military means, if necessary, to do something about it. And so in 1867, Parliament approved a military expedition. But this wasn't a war of conquest. The mission was clear. Rescue the hostages, punish Tewodros if necessary, and leave. Command of the mission was given to Lieutenant General Sir Robert Napier. Napier spent his entire adult life in the service of the Empire. He was born in 1810, shortly after his father, an army officer, was killed storming Fort Cornwallis in the Dutch East Indies, hence his unusual middle name. I've recently talked about that action in my episode about General Robert Rollo Gillespie, who happened to command the British forces in that battle. Check it out afterwards. After an education in England, he sailed to India, aged just 18, with a commission in the Bengal Engineers. He saw action throughout the subcontinent, fighting under Sir Hugh Gough during the First and Second Anglo-Sikh Wars, where 2 of his horses were shot from beneath him at the battles of Mudki and Ferozeshah. He played a pivotal role in the Siege of Lucknow during the Indian Mutiny, or the Indian Revolt, and later commanded a division in the Second Opium War in China. By the time of the Abyssinian crisis, 57-year-old Napier was Commander-in-Chief of the Bombay Army. British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli gave Napier 2 objectives. Firstly, free the captives, and secondly, remove Tewodros from power, preferably by capturing him and bringing him to London. Military and political leaders in Britain initially suggested a quick rescue operation with a small mobile force. Napier dismissed this as suicidal. Based on his experiences in the northwest frontier, he insisted the mission would need to be done properly or not at all. And with his track record, London agreed. What followed was a logistical triumph. Napier's plan involved a full expeditionary army consisting of 13,000 British and Indian troops and 8,000 auxiliaries. They would be transported by 291 ships and land at Zula, a barren stretch of the Red Sea coast in modern-day Eritrea. His entire force would then march more than 400 miles inland to the fortress at Magdala, where the European captives were being held. The route crossed largely unmapped, mountainous terrain rising to over 3,000 feet, with no roads, no infrastructure, and no certainty of local cooperation. From the first troops setting foot on the shore at Zula, the expedition would take 9 months to reach its objective. To reach Magdala in one piece, free the captives, remove Tewodros from power, and then safely march out of the country again, Napier was to use 36,000 animals, horses, mules, camels, oxen, even elephants for hauling artillery. His supply train included 70,000 pounds of salt beef, 30,000 gallons of rum, 3,000 tins of condensed milk, and 800 leeches for his medical teams. He brought the latest steam-powered water condensers from America, capable of providing 200 tons of clean drinking water every day, and even a team to build a railway to transport his supplies inland. Also accompanying his expedition were trunks containing 500,000 silver Maria Theresa thalers, the only currency universally accepted in Abyssinia. Specially purchased from the mint in Vienna, Napier planned to use these to both purchase local supplies and also, more importantly, to buy the support of local warlords. It was acting as a guard for this bullion shipment that our old fictional friend, Harry Paget Flashman, appears in this campaign. His adventures, captured by George MacDonald Fraser in Flashman on the March, provide an interesting and amusing commentary on the expedition. Now, whilst Flashman might be a made-up character, real members of Napier's entourage included geologists, zoologists, a representative of the British Museum, more about him later, and 11 journalists, including a young Henry Morton Stanley, years before his famous Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Within his 13,000-strong fighting force were 10 regiments of Indian infantry and 4 of cavalry, along with the 33rd Regiment of Foot, the Duke of Wellington's, the 1st Battalion, 4th King's Own Royal Regiment, and the 45th Foot, later the Sherwood Foresters, from the British Regular Army, and providing further mounted support with the 3rd Dragoon Guards. Also accompanying his army were contingents of the Royal Engineers, the Madras Sappers, the Bombay Sappers, and also the Naval Brigade, complete with rocket artillery. It was a powerful, well-armed, well-trained army, some of whom wore traditional redcoats, whilst others had recently started adopting the new khaki uniforms. Napier's diplomatic path inland was aided by Captain Tristram Speedy. Standing at 6'6", that's nearly 2 metres for my metric friends, this adventurer had previously trained the Abyssinian army before falling out with the Emperor. He knew the country well, spoke the language, and dressed in traditional warrior costume. With Speedy's help, Napier secured safe passage through the territories of suspicious warlords, in particular Dajamach Kasai of Tigray. And then with the help of some of those Maria Theresa coins, Napier, using Speedy's services, was able to buy the support of the powerful Gala tribe, who now ranged their warriors against Tewodros. The march to Magdala was a race, Napier's army versus Tewodros, who was hauling his personal artillery, including a huge cannon capable of propelling 1,000-pound balls, which he called Sevastopol. The terrain was punishing. Steep mountains, deep ravines, narrow passes. And yet Napier pressed on, building roads and bridges as he went. Progress averaged just 7 miles a day. But by April 1868, they were within striking distance of Magdala. But Tewodros had got there first. By now, the Emperor's behaviour was growing increasingly erratic. One moment he offered to release his captives, the next he rescinded the order. Then he placed peace feelers, then threats. Napier was baffled. maybe it made him take his eye off the ball, because on the 10th of April, he made his only mistake on the expedition, and it nearly ended in calamity. 400 miles into enemy country and nearing Magdala, he allowed his baggage train to cross a plateau below the Abyssinian position, in the mistaken belief that his advance column was protecting it. In reality, that advance column was in a valley beyond, totally oblivious to the disaster that was about to unfold. Tewodros ordered his men to attack the lightly defended supply column. As thousands of Abyssinian warriors poured down the mountainside, Napier rushed the 23rd Punjab Pioneers and the King's Own Regiment to the rescue. The Abyssinians charged down the mountain towards the thin line of British and Indian soldiers. Napier's men opened fire. It made not a jot of difference. The Abyssinian warriors kept coming. But now it was their turn to make a mistake. A traditional Abyssinian tactic was to keep running at their enemies and get to them before they could reload. What the mountain warriors didn't realise was that the British, although not the Indians, were armed with the latest Snyder repeating rifles. There was no gap between the volleys. The Abyssinians lost 700 men dead and 1,500 wounded, many of whom died of their injuries. Napier, on the other hand, lost just 2 men killed and 18 wounded. Tewodros, watching the carnage, finally released the hostages. They raced down the mountain to the British lines, eager to escape before the Emperor changed his mind once again. But if he hoped that this would satisfy Napier, he was wrong. The British commander had been given 2 objectives: rescue the prisoners and capture Tewodros. Hoping to avoid the inevitable bloodshed if he had to storm the mountain fortress, Napier gave Tewodros 48 hours to surrender. When no reply came, the final assault began at 9 a.m. on the 13th of April. All that morning, Napier's artillery had pounded the walls of Magdala to little effect. At 3 p.m, the Royal Engineers and Bombay Sappers were sent forward to blow the main gate, supported by the 33rd Regiment of Foot, the Duke of Wellington's. Upon arriving at the gate, the engineers realised that their task was hopeless, as the defenders had piled heavy stones for 15 feet beyond the timber gates. Moreover, they realised that for some incomprehensible reason, they had not brought any gunpowder, axes or ladders. It was now that the 33rd Regiment made one of those daring attacks that are a hallmark of the British Army's history. Private James Bergin, a giant of an Irishman, used his bayonet to pull away the thorn bushes in front of the wall, and then asked the drummer, Michael Magna, to give him a lift up. When it transpired that Bergin was too heavy, he then put Magna on his shoulders and pushed the drummer up the last few feet with his rifle butt. Sitting astride the wall, the drummer hauled Bergin up, and whilst Bergin opened fire on any Abyssinian he could see, Magna continued to pull up his comrades. Both men were awarded the Victoria Cross. Bergin would later transfer to the 78th Highlanders and died in Pune, India, in 1880, aged just 35. Magna would eventually emigrate to Australia, where he died in Melbourne in 1897. Within minutes, the 33rd were inside, opening fire on the defenders, who retreated to the inner fortress. Inside the citadel, Tewodros, vowing not to be taken alive, committed suicide, using a pistol gifted to him by Queen Victoria. With their king dead, those warriors who'd stayed with him surrendered. Over 60 Abyssinians were killed and 120 wounded at the Battle of Magdala. British losses were, as some of the journalists noted, almost embarrassingly low, just 15 wounded. Napier had succeeded in both his objectives, rescuing the hostages and removing Tewodros from power. The whole campaign from start to finish had cost him just 35 European soldiers, mostly to illness and heat exhaustion, and another 300 sick or wounded. The Indian contingent suffered similar numbers. The British Army, having accomplished its mission with extraordinary efficiency, set fire to the fortress and then began the long withdrawal to the coast. By the 10th of June, less than 2 months after the fall of Magdala, the whole expedition had departed Abyssinia. Napier left nothing behind, not even the railway tracks. So, unlike many later Victorian campaigns, the Abyssinian campaign did not add a single inch to the British Empire. It was a rare example of imperial restraint. But that's not to say that its effects were entirely benign. During the capture of Magdala, British troops seized thousands of items, religious manuscripts, ceremonial crosses, royal garments, and personal possessions of Tewodros. Some were presented to Queen Victoria. Others were bought up by various museums. And at the head of the pack was that representative accompanying Napier from the British Museum. Ethiopia has long demanded their return. While a few items have been repatriated, such as Tewodros' golden crown, which was returned by George V to Emperor Haile Selassie, the majority remain in British institutions. In Ethiopia, Tewodros is remembered not as a tyrant, but as a martyr, a man who sought to unify and modernise his country, but was overwhelmed firstly by foreign indifference and then invasion. And just like regime change operations since then, it's one thing to remove a ruler, but quite another to create a stable state afterwards. With Tewodros' death, the empire that he'd struggled to unify collapsed back into civil unrest. Rebellions flared, and warlords returned to their traditional strongholds. Eventually, in 1872, a strong man finally emerged. Kazai of Tigray, the man bought off by Napier, seized power. He was crowned Emperor Johannes IV. He brought a measure of stability to the country, but was killed in battle in 1889, fighting Mahdist invaders from Sudan. His successor, Menelik II, would strengthen Abyssinia and would inflict a crushing defeat on the invading Italians at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. Napier returned to a hero's welcome in Britain, where he was given a peerage, becoming Lord Napier of Magdala. He ended his military career as Commander-in-Chief India and a Field Marshal. Whilst Napier had achieved his twin objectives and had lost virtually no men, some in Britain questioned the cost of this rescue mission. Parliament had originally authorised £2 million for the campaign, funded by a temporary penny increase on income tax. But Napier's final bill came in at £8.6 million, well over £1 billion in today's money, and all to free a few dozen British captives. Critics in Parliament called it excessive, but Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli waved it off. He called such objections penny pinching. The two objectives have been achieved, and almost without loss. And considering Britain's bloodier experiences in Afghanistan, Zululand and Sudan, it could have been far worse. The vast, rugged Ethiopian highlands could have become a graveyard for the British, as the Italians would find out when they lost over 1,000 men at Adwa 20 years later. When compared to those later campaigns, Napier's achievement from a military perspective was outstanding. To take an army 400 miles into inhospitable, uncharted territory, keep it fed and watered so that it could free all the captives, defeat the Abyssinian Emperor, and then retrace its steps with only the slightest of losses was incredible. It became, and still is, a textbook example of logistical brilliance, achieved not by an infantry general, but by an engineer. And all in the name not of conquest for the British Empire, but protecting British citizens imprisoned by a foreign power. As Harry Flashman himself said, it was probably one of the most laudable military expeditions by the British in the 19th century. But, as the fictional cad also noted, the whole situation could have been avoided if the Foreign Office had responded to Tewodros' letter with just a tad more urgency. Two great observations from the wonderful Sir Harry Flashman. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. It really is a masterclass in logistical organisation by Sir Robert Napier, a British military commander who's pretty much forgotten nowadays. But as in his day he was respected enough to be buried in St Paul's Cathedral, I will tell his full story in the near future. In the meantime, thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.